Hey, welcome to App Design Tips. This is Caleb, and today I want to show you how to create a responsive design using the layout grid here inside of Figma. And to start off, I created a website blank artboard here on the left, and you can see this doesn't have a layout grid applied. And then we have this website page that does have a layout grid applied. And if we click into the settings here, we can see there's a margin of 42 pixels here on the edge and a gutter of 20 pixels in between each column. And what happens is if I stretch this down here, it retains that 20 pixels in between the column and the 42 pixels. So only the columns themselves squish inside of this artboard. So what does that mean for your designs? Well, I'm going to click on this website page here, and I already designed some elements inside of this page. And I'll click on this one and pull this up, and I've designed some elements within here. So we can see on both pages, if I click on this element and hold down Option to see what the spacing is, everything's spaced 20 pixels apart, and everything looks exactly the same on both of these artboards. And that's because we haven't tested the responsiveness yet. Now what I've done on this artboard is set up some constraints. So if I click on this element, we can see that we are constraining this to the left and the right, and that's actually constraining to the left and right of this column here. So to the left of this column and to the right of this column. It's much different than setting this up to the left and right. So you can see I have a scale here, but if I change this to be the same exact setting here, left and right, let's see what happens when I stretch this responsive design. It doesn't behave how I want it, and now if I stretch this one, it does. And you can see when I stretch this down here, and I'll stretch this artboard down, we can still go into here, hold down Option, and we can see that there's still 20 pixels in between each element. Here there's 14 pixels because it's just squishing everything else down. So I'm going to hold down Undo. And that's the difference in the power that you can have using these layout grids for responsive design, is your constraints actually apply to these columns here. And now as you can probably see here, we have a 4-column layout. So if I try to stretch this, we can see that things look broken there as well. That's because things aren't fitting in this 6-column layout here. But I can create frames that are independent of this artboard where the responsive constraints apply to only that frame. And how I do that is I will drag a rectangle and select all of these objects, and I will hit Command G or Control G on the windows to group all of these elements together. And now I'm going to turn this group into a frame. And now I can apply a layout grid specifically to this frame that's independent of this frame. So I'm going to click Layout Grid here, go into the grid settings, and I will choose a column grid. And now I want this to be, this is 4 columns, and I want the gutter to stay 20 pixels. And so now we can see if I move this outside of the frame here, this now has its own layout grid. And so now when I stretch this, everything looks really good and it doesn't look broken because these elements are behaving dependent of these columns. So now, even if I grab this group or this frame and I add it inside of this frame here, we can see there's a frame within a frame, then the elements in this frame are not going to respect the layout here. It's going to have its own layout. And so now I can click on this frame and I can choose to have a left and right constraint here. So this frame will resize based on this frame, but the elements will resize differently. And so now I can hide these columns. So I'll just click this eyeball icon and hide these columns here. And we can see that everything looks nice and even. In fact, if I show this again, we have these circles that are constrained to the left bottom of this column. This one's constrained to the left bottom of the column. And then this one is the right and the right. So now when I stretch this, everything maintains the same pixel spacing. So we can see here there's 10 pixels in between this circle and the square, and there's still the 21 pixels in between each of these elements. No matter how I resize this, it retains the same spacing. And even with these stars, I created a center constraint to center on these columns, and so it's now centering on these 4 columns. And so when you create a website, there may be times where you use the top section that's 3 columns, the bottom section is 4 columns, and maybe a section down here is 2 columns. So you can create independent frames and create the responsive design based off of that. Now let's look here on the left. This has no columns set up, and I tried to do my best to replicate the same type of thing here, not using layouts. So we can see that I still have a scale, so I want this to scale. And so now when I stretch this down, and I'm going to undo that, I'm going to just change this to scale as well. And now when I stretch this down, it appears like it's doing the same thing as this, but we notice here, if we jump into this square, we can still see 20 pixels. And now this used to be 20 pixels and now it's 13.81. So it's scaling differently. It doesn't have any columns to guide the resizes. And also here, where we had pin to the left here and pin to the right here, if I were to try to pin this to the left here, and I'll pin this to the left as well, and we still want these guys to be scaled, here we have an unpredictable behavior where things look broken because it's actually pinning to the left of this actual frame or artboard. And so the best way, or the closest way that I can match that, is with a scale. So I can scale these as well, but because they're a circle, they're going to look skewed here. So they are scaling, but they're not scaling vertically. So there's not a true way to make your design look truly responsive without using some columns and some grids. And we can see here, this is actually a predictable behavior down here without using a layout. So I wanted this rectangle to be static, just to stick to the left and the top, and we can see these guidelines showing us where they're sticking. Now we have this text that shows we want to constrain to the left, right, and to the top here. So because it's constrained like that, we can now drag this over and everything looks really good. And I'm just going to change this to 1024 pixels. That's where we started out. Now this kind of element may work good under a frame without a layout grid, but watch what happens if I just hold down Command C or Control C on the Windows and Command V over here. We're pasting that selection in here and it still looks exactly how it does in this artboard, but now when I stretch this, it looks broken. It has the same kind of constraint setup: left top, left top, left and right top, left and right top. But the difference is this is trying to respect those constraints again. So I'm going to move this back to 1024 pixels. So there may be times you don't want these elements to respect your layout grid. And here is where our problem is here. We want this to be a static width, and we want this to be a width that is relevant to this. So it looks broken, it doesn't work, and we can actually change that. All we have to do is click on these two objects, hold Command G to group these, and we can turn this group into its own frame. And then we can say we don't want a layout grid inside of this frame, we want it to be independent. So now we can tell this frame we want this frame to be constrained to the left and right of this frame, but there aren't any columns inside of this frame. So now when we resize this, it behaves exactly how it should. So that's just a few ways that you can create your designs using these layout grids here. And to show you a real-world example of this, we have this Microsoft Acrylics materials page here. And inside of this page, we have some boxes here. So inside of the desktop, we can see that we don't have any layout grids here whatsoever. We just have an image that we are constraining. You know, it's just scaling as we scale the artboard. And then we have this box here that is just pinned to the left top. So there's no resizing of this. And now I've grouped these things into frames. This is a 3-column frame, and we can see it's turned on and off. So you can see I created 3 columns, and I have a 5-pixel gutter in between each column. So I'm going to turn that off. We also have this thin light that's just a 2-column. So I set that up as its own frame with its own layout grid. And now I have this 4-column, and I changed this frame to have 20 pixels in between each column and to retain those pixels. So it's different than these 5 pixels here. And I'm just going to hide these. So even though they're hidden, then the constraints still respect those columns. And now here's the kind of design that you can create here with 3-column, 2-column, and 4-column. And even like a sidebar, if you're creating a web application with a sidebar, you can do it this way. So now I can stretch this, and you can see that this left box is static, and everything else is just breaking down exactly how you want it to here in this artboard. And if we stretch it to be super wide here, we can still double click inside of here and see that we have 5 pixels in between each of these columns, just like we have set up, and 20 pixels inside of these columns how we have it set up. So the layout grid doesn't even have to be on the main artboard. It can be within these grouped frames here to constrain your layout differently in each section of the website. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please subscribe to my channel where I'll post more videos like this regularly.